Welcome to Have You Heard, where we talk about issues at the intersection of agriculture and engineering. Let's get started. Here are your hosts, Morgan Hayes and Josh Jackson.
Welcome to the Have You Heard podcast. This is our first live episode. My name's Morgan Hayes. I'm an assistant professor in Biosystems and Ag Engineering, and I farm in Boyle County with my husband, about 500 acres. We have a commercial cattle herd and a hay operation there.
And I'm Josh Jackson, assistant professor in Biosystems and Agriculture Engineering, focusing in precision livestock farming. And my farming background is related to producing hay and raising registered Angus cattle.
And today we're going to do a little bit of our background, what's been happening on our farm this week, and then we're going to talk about the fencing schools that UK puts on. We're currently at the fencing school at the Harold Benson Research and Demonstration Farm at Kentucky State University. And these fencing schools are a great experience for producers in the state. And even us, those of us with PhDs, learn something every time we come. So let's get started, Josh, with what's happening on your farm this week.
So what's happening on my farm this week is we're putting down a lot of lime. So we were bringing in a couple truckloads of lime spreading across the farm. We've looked at the fertilizer prices and decided that they apparently don't want us to apply any next year. So we're going to definitely put down some lime and try to make the fields as, if we do apply, responsive as possible.
That's a great idea, yeah. This is a proper time of year to do lime application, and we've been very lucky. We missed a little bit of rain about a week and a half ago, and it left the fields enough time to dry out enough to get some lime trucks in, so that's a great option.
Still a wet spot. Still had to get a dozer out there to pull them out one time, but other than that, it's been went fairly well. So there's always one spot where like, oh yeah, don't go that way because it stays wet. So
absolutely, yeah. We're finishing up a little bit of bush hogging on some of our pastures that are getting finished up for the year, trying to get a final clip on them. Just generally moving around our rotational systems, trying to make sure that we utilize the last of the grass as effectively as we can. We do stockpile a little bit of fescue, but we don't tend to stockpile later into the winter. We try and use it up a little earlier. We don't like to do quite as aggressive a strip grazing as some people do. And so we're sort of finishing up on some of that. And we did finish our cattle working last weekend, which was a big deal. So our fall calving herd, our youngest calves were old enough to get their first round of vaccinations. They were over a month old. So we did do that first set of working.
We did some bush hogging as well. So similar to you, we're doing bush hogging, but we were kind of bush hogging around the pastures, edges, and fence lines, trying to get everything knocked down for the winter and just clean up pastures, clean up hay fields.
Absolutely.
We didn't fully cut a couple of hay fields, and we just went ahead and bush hogged down some of the Johnson grass and just cut high.
Perfect.
Just knock it down.
Yeah, and it was a hard frost. Was almost exactly a week ago now, so we now have had a killing frost, which does make us a little bit more aware of where our Johnson grass is in the field and making sure we don't have any prussic acid poisoning. Yep. So fortunately, we haven't had any fields that we've had to concern ourselves with this year. But
we've been cognizant and tried to just make sure we have a couple of fields of Johnson grass. The cows weren't in those pastures. When it gets to be the fall, now we can put them in there.
Yep, now it's prime time right now to get that grazing done on those fields. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit today about the fencing schools. The fencing schools are sort of a joint project that's put on by Extension as well as some industry partners. We have some industry partners that engage with us, Stay Tough, Gallagher, ACI, who does a lot of equipment sales, not direct, but to larger distributors. They're a large
throughout the state.
Yeah, they're a national distributor. And one of the things that's really nice about the fencing schools is we do some educational work typically in the morning in the classroom, and then in the afternoon we go out in the field. And today, with rain chances as they are, we did the hands-on portion that's typically in the afternoon first. So Josh and I snuck in a little bit early today just to get this podcast done. But these are really a nice option to actually see hands-on how to build a brace, how to put up wire, some of the general pitfalls that often occur with fencing. And, even knowing how to fence or thinking I knew how to fence, I still learn something every time I come to a fencing school. Josh, what do you think is probably one of the lessons you've learned?
Well, for me, I get a lot of benefit whenever Clint talks about the legal ramifications of putting in a fence and putting it on the boundary. So he always said, put your fence on the boundary. It's responsibility of both landowners. So that's been a huge benefit to me, just knowing exactly, because we share property lines with various people. And so just knowing what exactly you're entitled to, where to put it, what type of fence needs to be there, can be a huge benefit. Just knowing what's legally required or what's to be a safe and sound fence.
Yeah, I think that's pretty true. And one of the things I find really interesting is we talk a lot in the fencing school about high tensile wire, what is essentially a high carbon steel wire, and the strength differences between that and a low carbon steel. And, one of the things that every year I come back and I'm always amazed by is we talk about the strength of the materials and the fact that a 12.5 gauge, which is significantly smaller than a standard number 9 wire that people would typically use on a brace, still has strength that's almost a third more than the number 9 wire. So that 12.5 gauge wire, it's just phenomenal how much extra strength they get with that higher carbon content in that steel. And I'm always amazed every time I hear that number. It just surprises me each year.
It does have a lot of strength and it has a lot of versatility. So when you're actually going out there to put it in, it's actually cost you less than a typical, like a roll of big number 9 wire. If you have the heavy duty number 9 wire versus getting a high tensile or the high tensile woven wire or the fixed knot woven wire, it's really going to be a lot of cost savings there for you.
Yeah, and especially as steel prices have gone up in the last year, the benefit of having less steel in your fence, if you're getting actually more strength out of less steel, is a tremendous benefit because the costs do reflect the amount of steel in the fence at this point.
And, I think a lot of producers are able to take advantage. I think, we've gone towards a system for a while there and we kind of switched back to more traditional woven wire, high tensile, fixed knot fences. But we had traditionally used just regular woven wire for a number of years, and you saw it, degrade over time. But this fixed knot fence is actually able to last for 30 years. It's got the Class 3 galvanized, and so it's actually a very resilient fence.
Yeah, it is. It is absolutely a resilient fence. And would you say that's your favorite type of fencing at this point?
I would. At this point, I would definitely say for a while there we used the electrified high tensile, and it worked, but it requires a lot more maintenance. We just don't have the time for maintenance at this point. So that fixed knot is my preferred fence by far.
Yeah, and actually one of the things that we'll do in the educational portion when we're in the classroom is we'll look at some economics on it, and it's fascinating that high tensile fixed knot steel fence it costs out almost the same as a barbed wire fence, and that to me is always amazing. It's partly the benefit of being able to stretch out your post spacing and partially just the cost of the materials. But that is a far more desirable fence to me than 4 or 5 strands of barbed wire. To me, that's not my favorite fencing material to work with. I will be honest.
Definitely not. I can understand. I've had many gloves torn up by barbed wire. Many gloves.
Yeah, and on my farm, we do a lot of smooth wire electrified high tensile fence, 5 strand, and we do that for a couple reasons. But I personally like that. That is definitely our lowest cost fencing option out there on the market. So if anyone's trying to figure out how to put up fence for the least cost, I would say that an electrified high tensile fence is probably going to be your best bet. The other real benefit, I think, is I have all my animals now trained to electrified fence, and so for me that's really easy. It makes it much easier for me to put in some temporary fencing. I know that the animals are going to respect anything that looks like it could shock them, and it will, because I do actually keep them hot, or I attempt to most of the time.
Yep.
So that is really important, but for me that's a big deal that I know I have a fence that they're trained to. Least cost option to put in. And we've put in a lot of fence in the last couple of years, and just from an investment standpoint and how much depreciation my farm can take, that's also a big deal for me, that we can actually stretch it out and take the full depreciation on it.
We've also been so we have our fixed knot woven wire fence, but we've actually put an electrified strand on the inside of it, so to actually help deter the animals. So our bull lot actually has 2 strands going in there. So you get the physical barrier, then we also have that additional electrified deterrent running around the inside. So that's been a huge labor savings, because they're not pushing on the fence, they're not walking the fence as much, and so that helps us. They're not really putting as much stress and strain on the fence lines because we were replacing the bull fences 5 to 10 years because they were working it down.
Yeah, and that is one of the interesting things about that high tensile wire is that it doesn't have the same stretch in it.
Yep.
So even if you didn't have it on there, they wouldn't be able to wallow the fence quite as much. But I would agree, an offset is an excellent option all the time, and particularly for animals that are particularly nasty to fences.
Yes.
And bulls are. And it's not necessarily that they're trying to get through the fence. They're often just trying to scratch themselves on the fence. But those offsets are really nice, and we recently put out a new extension pub, so if anyone is interested in doing offsets, it gives some recommendations on the types of materials, the amount to offset. A lot of offsets that are sold are really narrow. You know, they're maybe 4 inches off of a post, and sometimes those smaller ones, that hot wire can get pushed back into the fence, which basically shorts out the hot wire, which makes it not effective for keeping animals off your fence. So I strongly encourage people to take a look at that offset because it does a really nice job of laying out why you need a little bit more space on your offsets. I was just talking to my graduate student out there, and one of the things we talked about is that for cattle we want to keep it nice and fairly low so that when the animals are grazing and rubbing, their shoulders and their butt are what hit it. But she has horses, and so for her the goal is actually to put it up higher so that they don't play with the other horses on the other side of the fence. And that's a personal decision depending on what you're trying to keep off and where you're trying to keep them off of a fence. So those offsets, though, I think are perfect for protecting a fence, which is a fairly large financial investment.
And even I know we had a horse whose hobby was he would take his hoof and just beat down on the fence. So he'd just break down the fence, then walk over at some point. So that was his hobby for the longest time. So that having that electrified wire was an additional deterrent for him to, instead of being pawing at the fence, it would actually keep him from doing that. So that was an additional, for us at least, in dealing with horses. Mom's horse, it was definitely a benefit.
Yeah, and I also have, and people know this, but I also have the alpacas, my pets. I call them my pasture pets. And those animals, because they're sort of similar to a small ruminant, which is actually our focus today here at KSU, is those small ruminants tend to be a little bit harder to shock, so we have to use a little bit more voltage on them. But I actually like that electrified smooth wire fence because I can actually do an alternating hot ground wire, and I don't have to use the ground, which their tiny little feet don't always ground them out very well. I can get them to ground out really good if they hit 2 wires at once. So that is another reason that I do like the smooth wire, high tensile, electrified.
Yeah, I mean, we've done some with with our small animals. We have some goats, and so just having that towards the bottom helps them from creeping under sometimes. So we have it a little bit lower than we would for cattle, but helps prevent creeping. So that's been an issue with some of the goats, especially around waterways. And so we'll have some additional chains or something dangling on the wire, so it helps to make sure we can hit the goats. So we have the woven wire, but we also have the wire running at the bottom electrified.
That makes a lot of sense, and it is interesting to see how people build different fences for different animals, but a good fence properly built will contain a lot of different animals, and those offset wires can very easily train animals of different size, even if the fence itself isn't exactly what you would want in the fabric material in it. So that is probably one of our benefits. So I think maybe with that we'll sort of close up for the day. We don't want to take too long. It's almost lunchtime here. What are you going to be doing next week on your farm, Josh?
Next week, we're going to be we actually have a class coming out to look. We're starting to synchronize some cows. So all our cows, we started synchronizing heifers this past Wednesday, and then we're synchronizing our cows next Tuesday.
Oh, that'll be great.
So putting in the seeders and then getting ready for the breeding day. Our big day is Black Friday. Most of the cows are synchronized. If they haven't come in heat by that point, they'll go ahead and be synchronized that day.
That's really neat, and I'm excited. I'm actually coming out to your farm when you're working the cattle to talk a little bit about the safety with handling cattle, and that's one thing that you and I are both really passionate about. On my farm this week, we're going to do probably a little bit of everything. We have a little bit more fencing to do, a little bit more wire to pull, and we will either be working on that or we just put in a new electrical service on the farm. And so we do have a little bit more wire to run, as long as we have enough money to pay for the wire. That's the next goal on the farm. And it'll depend on how much rain we get this week. If it's really wet, we won't be digging trenches to put in wire, versus if it's a little bit wetter, we can still actually do our fencing. All of our posts and our braces are set up. So That's something we can do with a little bit wetter ground.
Are you running the wire with having a rock saw come in, or are you just doing a backhoe?
We're going to use a small trencher. We already have the deeper wire going from the transformer that the electrical company has to a standalone service, and we're just running from that service out to a couple other smaller, some breakers and some different things depending on where we're running it.
Okay.
This is a smaller trencher, maybe 18 inches deep, but still it's sort of close to the yard and to my husband's grandmother's house. And, we're not looking to destroy her yard. That's not on our list of goals this week.
Not this time of year. Yeah.
Not at this time of year because it's not going to recover. So it'll be a little bit of a decision making based upon how the weather responds here today and tomorrow. So.
Okay. Sounds like it could be a fun time, though, on the farm.
It's always a fun time on the farm. And with that, we'll end for the day, and we'll see you guys next week.
Have You Heard is a production of the University of Kentucky College of Agriculture, Food and Environment, along with the Department of Biosystems and Agricultural Engineering. Discover what's wildly possible at ca.uky.edu.